The Church of All Saints with ossuary at Sedlec, located in central Bohemia near Kutna Hora, exists within a specific institutional and geographical context that shaped its function across 7 centuries. The site was established as part of the Sedlec Abbey, a Cistercian monastery founded around 1142. This monastery was the first Cistercian settlement in the Czech lands positioned in a region already under human cultivation during the early medieval period. The location contradicts the common assumption that Cistercian foundations were always established in undeveloped wilderness. Archaeological evidence indicates intensive human activity in the area during both early medieval and prehistoric times, suggesting the monastery occupied previously settled land rather than virgin territory. The Sedlec Abbey's economic foundation underwent transformation in the late 13th century following the discovery of silver ore deposits in the Kutna Hora region. Mining operations expanded rapidly, and the area developed into the most important mining center in medieval Bohemia. The monastery, which had originally derived income from agricultural estates, began receiving substantial financial compensation from the crown in exchange for providing timber, food, and road maintenance to support mining operations. This revenue stream enabled extraordinary architectural development within the abbey complex, including the construction of multiple churches and the expansion of burial facilities. By the turn of the 14th century, the Sedlec Abbey maintained at least 7 distinct burial locations within its grounds. 4 were located inside consecrated church buildings. 3 were exterior cemeteries adjacent to churches, the cemetery associated with the Gothic Church of the Assumption of Our Lady and St. John the Baptist served primarily as the burial ground for monks. Archaeological excavations conducted between 1998 and 2008 revealed that this monastic cemetery reached peak usage during the 13th century, before the construction of the Gothic church itself. A second cemetery existed adjacent to the church of SS Philip the Apostle and James, which had been erected in the first half of the 13th century near the monastery gate. This church served lay visitors and later assumed parish functions. Limited excavations in 1970 and 2014 identified burial activity at this site, though precise dating and spatial extent remain incompletely documented. The third exterior cemetery, and the one relevant to this analysis, surrounded what would become the Church of All Saints with ossuary. This cemetery occupied a position between the 2 other churches and eventually extended across an area measuring approximately 90 meters by 150 meters during the 17th century. The cemetery's medieval extent was likely larger, as suggested by 18th century reports of human remains discovered during construction activities outside the later defined boundaries. The design premise underlying medieval cemetery management at Sedlec reflected standard Cistercian burial practice adapted to local conditions. Cemeteries were not conceived as permanent repositories for individual graves maintained in perpetuity. Medieval burial theology distinguished between the body, which was corruptible matter, and the soul, which required spiritual intercession through prayer and masses. Once soft tissue decomposition was complete, skeletal remains could be exhumed to make space for new burials. This practice was both theologically acceptable and operationally necessary in enclosed cemetery spaces with continuous demand. Exhumed skeletal material was transferred to charnel houses, also called ossuaries. These structures served a dual function. Practically, they provided organized storage for bones removed from active burial plots. Theologically, they maintained the remains within consecrated ground while allowing ongoing commemoration through masses celebrated at altars within or adjacent to the charnel house. The ossuary was not a disposal site but a transitional space where the dead awaited resurrection while the living maintained spiritual obligations toward them. At Sedlec, this system operated within a modified framework shaped by a specific belief regarding the cemetery's soil. Historical accounts from the early 17th century, first documented by Simon Eustache Kapohorsky in 1630, and later elaborated by Augustin Sartorius in 1708, describe the Sedlec Cemetery as a campus sanctus, or holy field. According to these accounts, the cemetery's soil possessed properties that accelerated the decomposition of corpses, reducing them to clean bone within 24 hours. The origin narrative attributed this property to soil brought from the Holy Land by Abbot Heidenreich during the early 14th century and dispersed across the cemetery grounds. While no contemporary medieval documentation confirms Abbot Heidenreich's journey to Jerusalem, and the city was not under Christian control during his tenure, the narrative parallels similar legends associated with other European burial sites. The Campo Santo Cemetery in Pisa was believed to contain sacred earth from Mount Calvary, brought back during the Third Crusade in the late 12th century. A Crusader-era building at Akeldama in Jerusalem, constructed by the Knights Hospitaller, was similarly reputed to contain soil that consumed flesh rapidly, ensuring salvation for those buried there. These sites shared a common conceptual framework. Sacred soil could function as a form of purgatorial mechanism, accelerating the purification process required before resurrection. Whether or not Sedlec's soil possessed unusual geochemical properties, the belief in its efficacy had structural consequences. The cemetery attracted burial requests from distant regions, not merely from the local parish or monastery community. This extended catchment area created sustained demand that exceeded typical medieval cemetery capacity. The monastery, which controlled burial rites and collected associated fees, had financial incentive to accommodate this demand. The cemetery became a revenue-generating asset tied to regional reputation and pilgrimage activity. The intersection of belief, demand, and spatial constraint established the preconditions for the ossuary's eventual prominence. If the holy soil narrative encouraged burials from beyond the immediate region, and if the cemetery's physical boundary could not be indefinitely expanded due to consecration requirements and property limits, then the rate of exhumation and secondary deposition would necessarily increase. The charnel house would accumulate skeletal material faster than comparable sites, serving only local populations. This accumulation rate was manageable under normal mortality conditions. Medieval death rates were elevated by modern standards, but relatively stable year to year outside of epidemic or famine events. A cemetery serving a defined population could balance new burials against exhumations through predictable scheduling. The system assumed continuity, a steady flow of dead, regular turnover of grave space, and incremental transfer of bones to the charnel house. The system did not assume mass mortality events compressing years of normal death rates into weeks or months. It did not assume demand surges that would fill available grave space faster than decomposition could proceed. It did not assume scenarios where the ossuary would receive, within a brief period, skeletal material equivalent to decades of normal accumulation. Yet these scenarios occurred. Archaeological excavations conducted from 2016 onward beneath and adjacent to the Church of All Saints identified 32 mass graves containing approximately 1,200 individuals. These graves were distributed across two stratigraphically distinct layers. The upper layer has been provisionally associated with the Black Death epidemic of 1348 to 1350, based on the presence of Prague-Grecian coins dated shortly before 1346 within two of the graves. The lower layer's origin remains under investigation, though a connection to the famine of 1318 documented in the Zbraslav Chronicle has been proposed. The Zbraslav Chronicle, written by Peter of Zittau, records that 30,000 people were buried at Sedlec within a single year during the famine. While this figure is generally regarded as exaggerated, the discovery of mass graves containing tightly packed bodies in multiple layers confirms that extraordinary mortality events did occur, and that Sedlec served as a regional burial destination during crises. The chronicle's language is specific. Pits were dug and filled with corpses. This was not individual interment, but emergency mass disposal within consecrated ground. The mass graves represent a departure from normal burial procedure. Individual graves allowed for eventual exhumation and identification of remains for transfer to the ossuary. Mass graves, once filled and covered, were not accessible for selective exhumation. The bodies within them would decompose in situ. Only if the site were later disturbed through construction, grave reuse, or intentional clearance would the skeletal material be recovered and relocated. This creates a timeline problem. If mass mortality events deposited hundreds of bodies in concentrated areas during the 14th century, and if normal burial continued in other parts of the cemetery, then the ossuary was receiving material from two sources simultaneously: routine exhumations from individual graves and eventual recovery of remains from mass burial contexts. The volume of skeletal material entering the charnel house would not reflect a steady-state process, but a variable, episodic accumulation pattern punctuated by crisis events. The Church of All Saints with ossuary was constructed during the late 14th century, with archaeological evidence narrowing the construction window to between 1380 and 1400. The earliest written reference to the building dates to 1409, when a debt related to a mass performed in the ossuary was recorded. The structure was designed as a two-story building. The upper level functioned as a chapel for liturgical use by the living. The lower level served as the charnel house, where skeletal remains were deposited and where masses for the dead were celebrated at an altar. The architectural design assumes that skeletal material will be stored in this space indefinitely. Unlike a cemetery, where grave space is cyclically reused, the ossuary has no inherent mechanism for spatial turnover. Once bones are placed inside, they remain unless deliberately removed. The building provides fixed volume. If input continues and no output mechanism exists, eventual capacity saturation is inevitable. The design did not include specifications for maximum capacity. There is no documented protocol for what should occur when the available volume is full. This absence is not an oversight, but a reflection of assumptions about input rates. Under normal conditions, with a local parish population and routine exhumation schedules, the ossuary would fill gradually over generations. The question of what to do when full could be deferred to future administrators, who might expand the building, construct a second ossuary, or reduce input by closing portions of the cemetery. These assumptions broke down when input rates spiked due to mass mortality and when the cemetery's reputation as a holy field sustained demand from external populations. The ossuary was not designed to absorb the skeletal remains of thousands of individuals within a compressed time frame. Yet this is precisely what occurred. By the early 15th century, the Sedlec Abbey faced a spatial management problem that could not be solved through existing procedures. The cemetery contained mass graves that would eventually require clearance. The ossuary was accumulating material faster than anticipated. Burial demand remained elevated due to the site's reputation, and the physical boundary of the cemetery could not be expanded without violating consecration rules or acquiring additional property, both of which involved theological and financial complications. The Hussite Wars, beginning in 1421, introduced a catastrophic disruption. The monastery was attacked, buildings were burned, and monks were killed or expelled. When the Cistercians returned in 1454, they found the abbey's infrastructure destroyed and its economic base eliminated. The restoration process extended over 2 to 3 centuries. During this period, the cemetery and ossuary continued to function, but resources for maintenance and expansion were limited. The system's vulnerability was not a single design flaw. It was the interaction of multiple factors: a burial site with regional rather than local catchment, a belief system that sustained demand, a physical infrastructure with fixed capacity, episodic input surges from mass mortality, and institutional disruptions that prevented adaptive responses. Each factor alone could be managed. Together, they created a condition where the ossuary would eventually contain far more skeletal material than any comparable site, and where spatial constraints would force a transformation in how that material was organized. The system was designed to handle steady-state accumulation. It was not designed to handle punctuated surges. It was not designed to operate through institutional collapse and reconstruction. It was not designed for a scenario where the dead would outnumber the living's capacity to commemorate them individually. And yet, this is the scenario that unfolded. The question is not why the ossuary became overcrowded. The question is, what happens to a system when its core assumption that death is a manageable, distributed process is repeatedly violated? The transformation of Sedlec's ossuary from functional repository to ordered display did not occur suddenly. It emerged through incremental decisions made across generations, each of which appeared reasonable within its immediate context, but which collectively produced an outcome no single actor intended or foresaw. The latent conditions that enabled this transformation were embedded in institutional structure, theological doctrine, economic incentives, and the physical constraints of medieval construction. These conditions existed long before any crisis forced their interaction. The first latent condition was the ambiguity surrounding the theological status of exhumed skeletal remains. Medieval Catholic doctrine was explicit about the body's resurrection at the Last Judgment, but it provided limited guidance on how bones should be managed between exhumation and resurrection. The remains were sacred. They had been blessed at burial. They represented individuals who would be reconstituted, but they were also material objects that occupied physical space and required organization. This dual status created interpretive flexibility. Bones could be treated with reverence while also being moved, stacked, sorted, and arranged according to practical necessity. Charnel houses exploited this flexibility. They were simultaneously storage facilities and devotional spaces. The presence of an altar within or adjacent to the ossuary allowed masses to be celebrated for the dead, maintaining spiritual obligations. But the physical arrangement of bones within the space was left to local judgment. Some ossuaries simply piled bones against walls. Others created decorative patterns or sorted remains by type skulls separated from long bones, for instance. There was no standardized protocol. This absence of protocol was not a deficiency. It reflected the assumption that local conditions would dictate appropriate solutions. At Sedlec, local conditions included an unusually large volume of skeletal material and an ossuary that was architecturally prominent within the monastery complex. The building was not a marginal structure hidden from view. It was positioned centrally within the cemetery, adjacent to other major churches, and designed with 2 stories and twin towers. Its visibility signaled importance. The dead housed within were not forgotten. They were commemorated through ongoing ritual and architectural investment. This visibility created a representational problem. If the ossuary was a public-facing structure visited by pilgrims and donors, its interior could not appear chaotic or neglected. Disorder would suggest disrespect toward the dead, which would undermine the monastery's reputation and the cemetery's credibility as a holy field. Conversely, visible order would demonstrate that the abbey maintained proper stewardship over the dead entrusted to its care. The incentive structure favored organization over mere containment. The second latent condition was the monastery's economic dependence on burial revenue and pilgrimage activity. The Sedlec Abbey's wealth during the late 13th and early 14th centuries derived partly from royal compensation for supporting mining operations, but burial fees, donations from families seeking interment, and offerings from pilgrims visiting the Holy Field constituted a significant secondary income stream. This revenue was not guaranteed. It depended on maintaining the site's reputation. Reputation, in turn, depended on narrative consistency. If the cemetery was believed to contain sacred soil that purified the dead, and if the ossuary was the final resting place for those who had been purified, then the ossuary itself became part of the sacred landscape. Pilgrims who visited Sedlec to venerate the dead or to seek intercession expected to encounter a space that validated their beliefs. A disordered pile of bones would not validate belief. It would raise questions about whether the promised purification had occurred, whether the dead were truly cared for, and whether Sedlec merited continued patronage. The monastery could not afford to let these questions arise. Economic survival, especially after the Hussite Wars destroyed the abbey's material base, required demonstrating that Sedlec remained a site worthy of veneration and investment. This pressure existed independently of any explicit directive from church authorities. It was structural. The institution needed ongoing revenue. Revenue required sustained reputation, and reputation required visible evidence that the dead were properly managed. The third latent condition was the physical accessibility of the ossuary's interior. Unlike cemetery graves, which were buried and therefore invisible except during exhumation, the charnel house interior was accessible to anyone with permission to enter. Monks responsible for managing the space could observe the accumulation of bones directly. They could assess how much volume remained. They could see when disorder began to emerge as new material was added without corresponding organization. And they could make incremental adjustments, moving bones from one area to another, creating rudimentary stacks, clearing pathways, without requiring formal authorization or architectural modification. This accessibility meant that spatial management became an ongoing, low-level maintenance task rather than a discrete event requiring planning and resources. A monk could spend an hour reorganizing bones as part of routine duties. Over weeks and months, these small adjustments would compound. Patterns would emerge, not because someone designed them in advance, but because repeated actions under consistent constraints produce regularities. If bones are moved to maximize space efficiency, certain arrangements such as placing skulls in rows and stacking long bones in alternating orientations will naturally arise because they achieve higher packing density than random piles. The fourth latent condition was the lack of alternative disposal mechanisms. Once skeletal remains were placed in the ossuary, they could not be removed and relocated elsewhere without violating the principle that consecrated ground should retain the dead. Reburial outside the cemetery would suggest the bones were no longer sacred. Disposal in unconsecrated ground would imply abandonment. The ossuary was a terminal destination. There was no procedural exit pathway. This irreversibility had cascading implications. As the volume of skeletal material increased, the only available responses were to expand the building, construct additional ossuaries, or reorganize the existing material more efficiently. Expansion required financial resources and architectural intervention, both of which were constrained after the Hussite Wars. Constructing new ossuaries faced the same barriers. Reorganization required only labor, which the monastery possessed. The path of least resistance was internal optimization, arranging the bones in ways that maximize spatial efficiency while maintaining acceptable aesthetic presentation. The fifth latent condition was the absence of documentation requirements for ossuary management. No monastic rule specified how bones should be arranged, how often the space should be reorganized, or what criteria should govern decision-making. This absence granted local administrators complete discretion. Decisions made by one generation of monks would become precedents for the next. If an early organizer began stacking skulls in a particular pattern, successors would likely continue that pattern because deviation would create visible inconsistency. Over time, patterns would stabilize not because they were optimal, but because they were established. This path dependency locked in practices that might have originated as expedient solutions to immediate problems. A monk facing the task of incorporating newly exhumed remains into an already crowded space might create a decorative arrangement simply to avoid disturbing existing configurations. That arrangement, once visible, would set expectations for future additions. The cumulative effect would be a space whose organization reflected historical contingencies rather than deliberate design. The sixth latent condition was the theological interpretation of purgatorial time. Catholic doctrine held that souls in purgatory underwent temporal punishment for sins committed during life, and that this punishment could be reduced through prayers and masses offered by the living. The duration of purgatorial suffering was variable and unknowable. Some souls might require decades or centuries of purification before attaining salvation. This temporal ambiguity created an expectation that charnel houses would retain remains indefinitely. Bones could not be disposed of once purification was complete, because no external sign indicated completion. The safest assumption was that all souls, regardless of how long their remains had been in the ossuary, still required intercession. This assumption reinforced the irreversibility discussed earlier. Bones entered the charnel house and remained there indefinitely, pending the Last Judgment. The seventh latent condition was the monastery's vulnerability to external shocks that disrupted continuity of institutional memory. The Hussite Wars represented the most severe shock, but there were others. Fires, plagues, conflicts with secular authorities, and economic downturns tied to mining output fluctuations. Each disruption created gaps in personnel, records, and oral tradition. When monks returned to Sedlec after 1454, they inherited a physical space whose origins and organizational logic might not have been fully documented. They would have observed existing arrangements and inferred intent, but their inferences could diverge from original purposes. This erosion of institutional memory meant that practices initiated for pragmatic reasons could be reinterpreted as sacred traditions. If an early monk had arranged bones decoratively to solve a space constraint, and if later monks encountered that arrangement without understanding its origin, they might assume it reflected theological significance rather than logistical convenience. The arrangement would then be preserved and extended, not because it was necessary, but because it was believed to be meaningful. The eighth latent condition was the architectural positioning of the ossuary as a lower chamber beneath an active chapel. This vertical arrangement meant that the charnel house was directly associated with liturgical activity above. Masses celebrated in the upper chapel would be understood as benefiting the dead below. This spatial relationship reinforced the ossuary's integration into the monastery's devotional life. It also meant that any visitor attending services in the upper chapel would be aware of the bones beneath their feet, creating psychological and symbolic continuity between the living congregation and the dead awaiting resurrection. The proximity of the altar to the skeletal remains elevated the theological importance of how those remains were presented. If the ossuary was merely a storage basement, disorder might be tolerable. But if it was a devotional space intrinsically linked to active worship, disorder would constitute a form of liturgical negligence. The architectural design itself encoded expectations about maintenance standards. The ninth latent condition was the medieval preference for visual pedagogy in communicating theological concepts. Church interiors were filled with imagery frescoes, sculptures, stained glass that illustrated biblical narratives, saints' lives, and eschatological themes. The faithful, many of whom were illiterate, learned doctrine through visual observation. The ossuary, if organized deliberately, could function as a form of visual theology. The sheer quantity of bones would communicate the universality of death, while their orderly arrangement would suggest the promise of resurrection and the efficacy of prayer in aiding souls through purgatory. This pedagogical potential created an incentive for monks to treat the ossuary not merely as storage but as a didactic space. A random pile of bones taught nothing. An organized display of bones, particularly if arranged in patterns that evoked liturgical symbols or architectural forms, could reinforce theological messages. The ossuary could become a three-dimensional sermon on mortality, judgment, and salvation. The 10th latent condition was the cultural practice of commemorating the dead through physical proximity and ongoing interaction. Medieval Catholicism did not conceive of death as absolute separation. The dead remained part of the community, accessible through prayer, venerated as intercessors, and physically present in relics and burial sites. Charnel houses were locations where the living could encounter the dead en masse, not as abstract concepts but as tangible remains. This proximity created emotional and spiritual obligations. Families who had paid for burial at Sedlec expected their relatives' bones to be treated with care even after exhumation and transfer to the ossuary. If the bones were visibly neglected or disrespected, families might withdraw their patronage or question the monastery's spiritual authority. Conversely, if the bones were visibly honored through organization, decoration, or integration into ritual spaces, families would interpret this as evidence that their obligations to the dead were being fulfilled and that Sedlec remained a trustworthy steward. The 11th latent condition was the existence of precedents at other European sites where charnel houses had been decorated or organized artistically. The Camposanto in Pisa, the Akeldama building in Jerusalem, and various smaller ossuaries across Central Europe provided models that Sedlec's monks could observe or hear about through monastic networks and pilgrimage reports. These precedents demonstrated that decorative arrangement of bones was neither heretical nor unprecedented. If other sites had successfully integrated aesthetic organization into their charnel houses, Sedlec could justify similar practices by appealing to established custom. The availability of models reduced the perceived risk of innovation. A monk proposing to arrange bones decoratively could argue that he was not inventing a new practice but adopting one already validated elsewhere. This appeal to precedent would insulate the decision from theological criticism and provide assurance that the outcome would be acceptable to ecclesiastical authorities. The 12th latent condition was the gradual accumulation of bones over generations, which meant that no single individual confronted the full scope of the spatial problem at once. Each generation inherited a partially filled ossuary and added incrementally to it. The problem was always manageable within any given decade. Only across centuries did the cumulative effect become overwhelming. This temporal diffusion prevented any decisive intervention. No abbot faced a crisis moment that demanded comprehensive reorganization. Instead, each successive administrator made small adjustments that seemed adequate at the time. This incremental accumulation also meant that the transformation from functional storage to decorative display occurred so gradually that no one could identify when the transition happened. There was no formal decision to begin decorating the ossuary. Instead, there were hundreds of small decisions: how to place this femur, where to position that skull, that collectively produced patterns. By the time those patterns became visibly decorative, they were already established facts that subsequent monks would maintain rather than dismantle. The 13th latent condition was the post-Hussite Wars imperative to demonstrate institutional continuity and resilience. The monastery had been destroyed, its community scattered, its material wealth eliminated. Rebuilding required convincing donors, royal authorities, and the broader Catholic hierarchy that Sedlec remained a legitimate and significant religious institution. Physical evidence of continuity, such as a well-maintained ossuary containing the remains of pre-Hussite generations, would serve this purpose. If the bones could be shown to have been carefully preserved through the catastrophe, it would signal that Sedlec's sacred mission had not been interrupted despite physical destruction. This need to project continuity created motivation to invest resources in the ossuary's presentation, even when other reconstruction priorities were more urgent. A renovated charnel house would demonstrate to visitors that the monastery valued its heritage and maintained its spiritual obligations. It would also generate pilgrimage revenue, which was critical for financing broader reconstruction efforts. The ossuary became both symbol and economic asset, which elevated its priority in resource allocation decisions. The 14th latent condition was the availability of unskilled labor that could be directed toward organizing bones without requiring specialized training or significant expense. Monks performed manual labor as part of their daily discipline. Novices and lay brothers could be assigned to ossuary maintenance as part of routine duties. The task required patience and physical effort, but no particular expertise. This low-skill requirement meant that ossuary organization could proceed continuously in the background of monastic life, absorbing labor that would otherwise be idle or assigned to less symbolically important tasks. The cumulative effect of these latent conditions was a system in which decorative arrangement of skeletal remains became the path of least resistance. No single factor mandated decoration, but together, they created a decision environment where decoration was easier, cheaper, more justifiable, and more beneficial than any alternative response to spatial constraints. The system did not fail, it adapted. The adaptation, however, produced an outcome that diverged radically from the original function. A space designed for storage became a space designed for display. The human factors trap embedded in this system was the assumption that incremental optimization would remain functionally adequate indefinitely. Each generation of monks believed they were maintaining the ossuary properly by organizing it according to available space and aesthetic norms. They did not recognize that their cumulative actions were transforming the space's purpose. The trap was invisible because it operated across timescales longer than individual lifetimes. No single monk lived long enough to observe the full transformation. Each saw only their own contribution, which always appeared reasonable and necessary. By the time the ossuary's transformation became undeniable, when bones were no longer merely organized but explicitly shaped into chandeliers, coats of arms, and architectural ornaments, the process was already complete. The system had locked into a new equilibrium. Reverting to simple storage would now require dismantling established decorations, which would be interpreted as desecration. The path forward had become irreversible. The transformation of Sedlec's ossuary from repository to display did not begin with a discrete initiating event in the conventional sense of a mechanical failure or procedural violation. Instead, it began with a gradual divergence between the system's original function and the conditions under which it was forced to operate. This divergence became irreversible during the period immediately following the Hussite Wars, when the monastery's reconstruction coincided with the need to address accumulated spatial constraints that had been deferred during decades of institutional collapse. The Hussite Wars began in 1421 with an attack on the Sedlec Abbey. Contemporary accounts describe the destruction as comprehensive. Buildings were burned, monks were killed or expelled, and the monastery's economic infrastructure was eliminated. The main abbey church, which had been constructed in Gothic style during the early 14th century under Abbot Heidenreich, was left roofless and unusable. The church of SS Philip the Apostle and James, which had served lay visitors and held parish functions, was similarly damaged. The Church of All Saints with ossuary, positioned centrally within the cemetery, sustained damage, though the extent is incompletely documented. What is certain is that the cemetery itself continued to receive burials during the conflict and its immediate aftermath, as evidenced by grave markers and burial configurations that post-date 1421. When Cistercian monks returned to Sedlec in 1454, 33 years after the initial attack, they found a landscape of partial ruins and neglected infrastructure. The monastery was administratively subordinated to the Bohemian monastery at Skalis due to its complete loss of economic base. Reconstruction proceeded slowly, constrained by limited resources and competing priorities. The main abbey church would not be fully restored until the early 18th century. The church of SS Philip the Apostle and James was renovated earlier, but remained structurally compromised. The cemetery and ossuary, however, required immediate attention because they generated revenue through burial fees and pilgrimage offerings that funded other reconstruction efforts. The ossuary, in 1454, contained skeletal remains accumulated over approximately 2 centuries, including material from normal burial turnover, mass graves from the 1318 famine and 1348 to 1350 plague, and burials that occurred during the Hussite period itself. The returning monks faced a space that was both overfilled and disordered. 30 years of institutional absence meant that no one had performed routine maintenance, organizing new additions, redistributing material to maximize space efficiency, or clearing pathways for access to the altar. The skeletal material would have settled, shifted, and possibly been disturbed by structural damage to the building during the conflict. The physical state of the ossuary created an immediate representational problem. If the monastery intended to resume accepting burials and attracting pilgrims, the charnel house could not remain in disarray. Visitors who descended into the ossuary expecting to encounter a sacred space would instead find evidence of abandonment. This would undermine claims that Sedlec had maintained stewardship over the dead during the crisis. The monastery's legitimacy depended on demonstrating continuity of sacred function despite physical destruction. The first recorded intervention dates to the late 15th or early 16th century, based on regional historical accounts that reference bone arrangement occurring approximately 2 centuries before the mid-17th century. Jan Bukowski, writing in 1700, notes that bones in the ossuary had been organized for nearly 200 years, which places the initial arrangement around 1500. This timeline aligns with the period when the monastery had sufficiently recovered from the Hussite wars to allocate labor and resources toward non-essential projects beyond basic structural repair. The intervention was attributed in later accounts to a blind individual, variably described as a friar, lay brother, or youth. This attribution appears in multiple sources from the 18th and 19th centuries, suggesting it was a stable element of oral tradition. The narrative's function was to minimize human intentionality in the decorative arrangement. By attributing the work to someone who could not see the bones they were organizing, the story implied that the arrangement emerged through divine guidance rather than aesthetic planning. This interpretive frame was theologically necessary. Decorating with human remains could be construed as disrespectful, unless sanctioned by higher authority. Attributing agency to God through the instrument of a blind organizer resolved the potential theological objection. Whether or not a blind individual participated in the actual organization, the arrangement clearly required sighted supervision and deliberate design choices. Bones were sorted by type skulls separated from long bones, which were separated from smaller skeletal elements. This sorting required visual identification. The sorted material was then arranged in patterns, skulls were placed in rows or stacks, long bones were positioned in alternating orientations to create interlocking structures, and smaller bones filled gaps to stabilize the configurations. These patterns achieved 2 objectives simultaneously. They maximized spatial efficiency by reducing void space between elements, and they created visual regularity that signaled intentional organization rather than random accumulation. The patterns were not yet decorative in the elaborate sense that would emerge in later centuries. They were organizational, functional arrangements that imposed order on previously chaotic material. But the distinction between organization and decoration is fluid. Once bones are arranged in visually regular patterns, those patterns acquire aesthetic dimension even if aesthetics were not the primary motivation. Visitors encountering rows of skulls would perceive deliberate design, and that perception would shape their interpretation of the space's meaning. The critical divergence occurred at this moment. The ossuary's original function was to provide storage for skeletal remains removed from the cemetery to make space for new burials. Storage requires containment and accessibility, but not visual order. Bones could be piled, stacked, or distributed randomly without compromising the system's core purpose. By introducing visual order, the organizers implicitly redefined the ossuary's function. It was no longer merely storage, it was presentation, and presentation implies an audience. This redefinition had cascading consequences. Once the ossuary became a space designed to be seen, it required ongoing maintenance to preserve visual order. New skeletal material added to the space could not simply be placed wherever room existed. It had to be integrated into existing patterns to avoid disrupting the overall aesthetic. This integration required more labor per unit of material than simple storage, but the labor investment was justified by the representational value. An orderly ossuary enhanced the monastery's reputation, which sustained burial demand and pilgrimage revenue. The shift from storage to presentation also altered the relationship between the living and the dead. In a storage-focused ossuary, skeletal remains were objects awaiting resurrection, present but not particularly visible. In a presentation-focused ossuary, the remains became active participants in liturgical and devotional life. Visitors descended into the charnel house, not merely to pray for the dead in abstract, but to confront mortality directly through visual encounter with organized bones. The bones became pedagogical tools, illustrating theological concepts about death, judgment, and resurrection. This pedagogical function was reinforced by the ossuary's architectural integration with the upper chapel. Masses celebrated above were explicitly performed for the benefit of souls in purgatory, whose remains rested below. The spatial relationship created a vertical axis connecting liturgy with commemoration. The more visually prominent the bones, the more tangible this connection became. Worshippers in the upper chapel could imagine the souls they were praying for as physically present beneath the floor, awaiting liberation through their intercession. The divergence between original function and actual use became fully manifest when the monastery began using the ossuary's organized appearance as a marketing tool. Documentary evidence from the 17th century indicates that pilgrims were specifically informed about the charnel house's unique character. Guidebooks and regional histories mentioned Sedlec's Ossuary as a notable feature, distinguishing it from ordinary cemeteries. This publicity was economically motivated, attracting visitors-generated donations that funded reconstruction projects. But it also locked in the decorative approach. Once the ossuary's appearance became a publicized asset, reverting to simple storage would eliminate a competitive advantage over rival pilgrimage sites. The monastery's economic dependence on the ossuary's reputation created a feedback loop. Maintenance of visual order required labor, which required funding, which required attracting visitors, which required maintaining visual order. This loop was self-reinforcing as long as resources permitted continued investment. But it also created vulnerability. Any disruption to the monastery's financial stability would threaten the ability to maintain the ossuary, which would undermine reputation, which would reduce revenue further. The first major test of this system's resilience occurred in 1657, when a Jesuit preacher named Rudolf Reichenberger visited the ossuary and questioned whether the displayed bones represented saved or damned souls. According to accounts recorded by Augustin Sartorius in 1708, Reichenberger's doubt was met with immediate physical response. A terrible noise erupted among the bones, and 2 large stones were thrown, forcing him to flee. This narrative served multiple functions. It demonstrated that the bones possessed agency and could defend their sanctity against skepticism. It reinforced the belief that everyone buried at Sedlec had achieved salvation, validating the Holyfield narrative. And it warned potential critics that doubting the ossuary's sacred status would have consequences. The Reichenberger incident reveals an underlying anxiety about the ossuary's theological legitimacy. If bones were being displayed decoratively, could this be interpreted as irreverence? If skeletal remains were being used to create visual impact, did this commodify the sacred? The monastery needed assurance that its practices were acceptable. The legend of divine intervention against a skeptic provided that assurance by suggesting that God himself endorsed the arrangement through miraculous defense of the bones' sanctity. A parallel incident allegedly occurred in 1663, when a young man from Kaslov wondered whether one of the skulls might belong to a hanged criminal. The skull reportedly jumped from its position and rolled beneath his legs, causing him to fall and die immediately. This story reinforced the same themes. The bones were conscious agents capable of defending themselves, and questioning their purity was dangerous. Both narratives functioned as apologia, justifying the ossuary's unusual presentation by attributing agency to the dead rather than to the monks who had arranged them. These defensive narratives emerged precisely because the ossuary had diverged so far from conventional practice that its legitimacy required supernatural validation. A normal charnel house storing bones without decoration would not generate theological controversy. But once bones were visibly organized into patterns that served aesthetic and pedagogical purposes, observers could reasonably ask whether this crossed a line between veneration and exploitation. The monastery could not answer this question through doctrinal argument alone. Catholic theology provided no clear guidance on decorative use of skeletal remains. Instead, it relied on miracle stories that positioned God as the implicit architect of the arrangement, with monks serving merely as his instruments. The divergence reached a critical threshold in 1661 when the ossuary underwent major renovation after decades of post-Hussite neglect. A dedicatory inscription recorded the event. This ossuary was newly erected from the last ruins in 1661. The phrase "newly erected" suggests more than simple repair. It implies reconstruction or significant reconfiguration. Archaeological investigations have not yet determined precisely what this reconstruction entailed, but the timing coincides with the first phase of Baroque-era renovations across the monastery complex. Other buildings were being restored in contemporary architectural styles, and the ossuary would have been included in this campaign. The 1661 renovation established a precedent that would be repeated in subsequent centuries. Each generation of monks would reinterpret the ossuary according to contemporary aesthetic norms, while claiming continuity with sacred tradition. The bones themselves remained constant, but their arrangement evolved. This evolution was presented as restoration rather than innovation, framing each modification as a return to proper order rather than the introduction of new design. The renovations were accompanied by increased documentation of the site's legends and history. Simon Eustoch Kapohorsky's 1630 chronicle provided the first printed account of the Holy Soil narrative and the ossuary's unique character. Augustin Sartorius's 1708 history expanded on these themes, describing the bones' miraculous properties and the divine interventions that protected them. These texts served to codify oral traditions into authoritative written accounts that could be referenced by future administrators and cited to external authorities when questions arose about the ossuary's practices. The codification of legend into documentary history marked another irreversible transformation. Once the Holy Soil narrative and the associated miracle stories were in print, they became fixed references that constrained future interpretation. Subsequent monks could not easily revise or abandon these narratives without contradicting established written tradition. The legends had to be maintained, which meant the ossuary's presentation had to continue validating them. If the bones were ever returned to simple storage, visitors would ask why the miraculously defended remains were no longer visibly honored. The answer would require admitting either that the miracles never occurred, or that the monastery had decided to abandon practices endorsed by God, neither of which was institutionally acceptable. By the early 18th century, the ossuary had completed its functional transformation. It was no longer a repository that happened to be organized. It was a designed space whose primary purpose was to present skeletal remains in ways that communicated theological messages. validated institutional narratives, and generated economic value through visitor attraction. The bones were no longer simply stored, they were curated. And curation requires ongoing aesthetic judgment, which means the space had become subject to artistic trends and stylistic evolution. The initiating event was not the Hussite Wars themselves, but the post-war reconstruction period when resource constraints and representational pressures converged to make decorative organization the optimal solution to spatial and institutional challenges. Once that solution was implemented and proven successful attracting visitors, generating revenue, and resolving spatial problems, it became locked in through economic dependence, documentary validation, and miracle narratives. The system had diverged from its original design parameters and entered a new operational regime from which retreat was structurally impossible. The divergence was not recognized as problematic by contemporaries because it solved immediate problems while maintaining continuity with core theological commitments. The bones remained in consecrated ground, masses were still celebrated for the souls of the dead, and families could still trust that their ancestors were being honored. What changed was the mode of honoring, from private storage to public display. This change appeared incremental and justifiable at each decision point, which is precisely why it became irreversible. No single monk made a decision to transform the ossuary into an art installation. Instead, hundreds of monks made small decisions to organize, maintain, enhance, and document the space in ways that collectively produced that outcome over centuries. The term failure in a conventional engineering analysis refers to a system's inability to perform its intended function due to physical breakdown, procedural error, or design inadequacy. At Sedlec, the ossuary did not fail in this sense. It continued to contain skeletal remains within consecrated ground, maintained accessibility for liturgical purposes, and fulfilled its theological mandate to honor the dead. What failed was the assumption that the system's original function, unadorned storage, would remain adequate indefinitely. The failure chain is therefore not mechanical but adaptive, a sequence of decisions that appeared locally rational but globally transformed the system's purpose beyond recognition. The first link in this chain was the decision to organize bones rather than simply pile them. This decision was made sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century, as discussed in the previous chapter. The immediate justification was spatial efficiency. Random piles of bones contain significant void space. A femur placed at an arbitrary angle occupies more volume than the same femur aligned parallel to others. Skulls, being roughly spherical, will settle into irregular configurations unless deliberately positioned. By sorting skeletal elements by type and arranging them in regular patterns, organizers could achieve higher packing density, thereby increasing the ossuary's effective capacity without architectural expansion. This justification was technically correct. Organized arrangement does maximize spatial efficiency, but the decision had second-order consequences that were not immediately apparent. Once bones were arranged in patterns, the patterns themselves became information. They communicated intentionality. A visitor entering the ossuary would observe the patterns and infer that someone had invested significant labor in creating them. This inference would prompt questions. Why was this labor invested? What does the arrangement signify? What am I supposed to understand from this display? The monastery answered these questions by framing the arrangement as an act of veneration. The bones were organized not merely for spatial efficiency, but to honor the dead and demonstrate proper stewardship. This frame was necessary to prevent the alternative interpretation, that the monastery was exploiting sacred remains for aesthetic effect. By emphasizing veneration, the monastery positioned itself as fulfilling religious duty rather than pursuing artistic ambition. But veneration requires standards. If the arrangement was intended to honor the dead, it had to meet certain thresholds of orderliness, cleanliness, and symbolic coherence. A haphazard arrangement, even if spatially efficient, would not convey veneration. The bones had to appear cared for. This requirement introduced a maintenance burden that exceeded simple storage. Bones had to be dusted, repositioned when they shifted, and repaired if structural elements collapsed. New material added to the ossuary had to be integrated seamlessly into existing configurations to avoid visible disruption. The second link in the failure chain was the decision to differentiate the ossuary through architectural enhancement. Sometime between the initial organization in the early 1500s and the 1661 renovation, Additional features were introduced: glass covers over bone pyramids, suspended crowns above the arrangements, and possibly early decorative elements that would later be expanded. These enhancements were documented in post-medieval imagery and textual descriptions. They served to distinguish Sedlec's ossuary from ordinary charnel houses by adding symbolic layers, crowns representing martyrdom, glass creating reliquary-like presentation, elevated positioning suggesting heavenly aspiration. These enhancements were justified by the monastery's competitive positioning within the regional pilgrimage economy. By the 17th century, Sedlec faced competition from other religious sites seeking donor support and visitor traffic. The monastery's primary asset was its reputation as a holy field with unique soil properties, but reputation alone was insufficient. Visitors needed tangible evidence that validated the claims. The ossuary, if presented compellingly, could serve as that evidence. The sheer quantity of bones demonstrated the site's historical importance. The quality of their arrangement demonstrated ongoing institutional vitality. Together, these factors justified continued patronage. The competitive dynamic created pressure for continuous enhancement. If a rival site introduced new devotional features, Sedlec needed to respond with its own innovations to maintain differentiation. This pressure was structural, not personal. Individual abbots might resist enhancement, but institutional survival required it. The monastery could not afford to let the ossuary stagnate while competitors advanced. The third link was the theological elaboration of bone agency through miracle narratives. As discussed in Chapter 3, stories about bones defending themselves against skeptics emerged in the 17th century. These narratives served apologetic purposes, but they also established expectations about how the ossuary should function. If the bones were believed to possess agency, to hear prayers, respond to doubt, and enforce their own sanctity, then they required appropriate staging. The space had to be configured in ways that acknowledged and facilitated this agency. This requirement introduced a feedback loop between narrative and physical arrangement. Miracle stories reference specific features: bones arranged in pyramids, crowns suspended above them, particular configurations that allegedly moved or made noise. These details, once embedded in narrative, became permanent constraints. Future modifications had to preserve or enhance the features mentioned in the stories, or else the stories would lose credibility. The narratives thus functioned as informal preservation mandates, limiting the range of acceptable changes. The fourth link was the monastery's economic dependency on ossuary-driven pilgrimage revenue. By the late 17th century, the Sedlec Abbey derived significant income from visitors who came specifically to see the charnel house. Entrance fees, donations, sales of devotional objects, and payments for commemorative masses constituted a stable revenue stream that supported reconstruction projects and operational expenses. This income was conditional on the ossuary maintaining its reputation as a unique and spiritually potent site. Economic dependency created institutional lock-in. The monastery could not discontinue enhancements without risking revenue loss, but enhancements required ongoing investment, which was only sustainable if revenue remained stable. This created a ratchet effect. Each enhancement raised visitor expectations, which necessitated further enhancements to meet those expectations, which raised costs, which required increased revenue, which required continued enhancement. The system could not reach equilibrium. It could only escalate. The fifth link was the monastery's decision to commission professional artistic interventions during the Baroque renovation campaigns of the early 18th century. Between 1708 and 1712, architect Jan Blazej Santini Eichel directed renovations of multiple structures within the Sedlec complex, including the main abbey church and the Church of All Saints with ossuary. Santini Eichel was known for his Baroque Gothic style, which combined medieval structural elements with Baroque decorative elaboration. His approach to the ossuary extended the existing organizational logic into explicitly architectural territory. Under Santini Eichel's direction, the bones were not merely organized but sculpted into forms that referenced architectural archetypes. Pyramids were regularized and given defined geometries. The glass covers were designed as reliquary housings. Crowns were gilded and positioned to create vertical emphasis. The overall composition transformed the charnel house into a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, where skeletal material functioned as both medium and message. This artistic intervention represented a threshold crossing. Prior to Santini Aschel, the ossuary's organization could be defended as maintenance and veneration. After his intervention, it was unambiguously artistic. The bones were being used to create aesthetic effects that served institutional objectives beyond simple storage or commemoration. This shift was not concealed, it was celebrated. The renovations were documented in dedicatory inscriptions and publicized through engravings that circulated regionally. The monastery explicitly marketed the ossuary as an artistic achievement, not merely a devotional space. The sixth link was the establishment of precedent that each subsequent generation would be expected to maintain and enhance. Once the Baroque intervention was complete, future abbots inherited a space that required ongoing curatorial care. Bones that fell from arrangements had to be replaced. Structural elements that deteriorated had to be repaired. Visitors who compared the current state to historical descriptions expected continuity or improvement, not decline. This created an obligation structure that extended indefinitely forward. Each generation was responsible for preserving what predecessors had created, while also contributing their own enhancements to be preserved by successors. This obligation structure was reinforced by the monastery's archival practices. Renovations were documented through inscriptions, account books, and commissioned imagery. These records established a narrative of continuous improvement, positioning each abbot as a steward who had advanced the site's development. Future abbots who failed to maintain or enhance the ossuary would be implicitly positioned as negligent, undermining their authority and legacy. The institutional incentive structure therefore favored continued investment even when resources were scarce. The seventh link was the physical aging of the skeletal material itself. Bone is a composite tissue containing organic and inorganic components. The organic component, primarily collagen, degrades over time through microbial action, oxidation, and mechanical stress. The inorganic component, hydroxyapatite mineral, is more stable but becomes brittle as the organic matrix deteriorates. Over centuries, bones transition from relatively robust structures to fragile objects that fracture easily under handling or environmental stress. This degradation process meant that the ossuary's material foundation was becoming progressively more vulnerable. Bones arranged in the 16th century would be structurally weaker by the 18th century. Bones arranged in the 18th century would be weaker by the 20th. Each handling episode, whether for maintenance, repair, or enhancement, imposed mechanical stress that accelerated degradation. The system was locked into a maintenance regime that paradoxically contributed to the long-term deterioration of the material it was intended to preserve. The eighth link was the environmental instability introduced by visitor access. The ossuary, being a subterranean chamber, naturally maintains relatively stable temperature and humidity due to thermal mass and limited air exchange. However, visitor traffic introduces fluctuations. Each visitor brings external air, body heat, and moisture. Over hours, these inputs accumulate, raising temperature and humidity levels. When the space is subsequently closed and visitors depart, conditions return toward baseline, creating diurnal or seasonal cycles. Bone is hygroscopic. It absorbs and releases moisture in response to ambient humidity. Repeated wetting and drying cycles induce dimensional changes that create internal stresses. These stresses manifest as surface cracking, delamination, and eventual structural failure. The more visitors the ossuary attracted, the more pronounced these environmental fluctuations became, and the faster the skeletal material degraded. The system's success measured by visitor numbers accelerated the physical failure of its constituent material. The ninth link was the introduction of artificial lighting in the 19th and 20th centuries. Prior to electrification, the ossuary was illuminated by natural daylight filtered through small windows and by candles or oil lamps during services. Electric lighting allowed longer visitor hours and enhanced visibility of decorative details, increasing the site's attractiveness and revenue potential. However, artificial lighting also introduced ultraviolet radiation and localized heating. Ultraviolet exposure accelerates the breakdown of organic components in bone, causing surface discoloration and embrittlement. Localized heating from light fixtures creates thermal gradients that exacerbate moisture cycling. These effects were not immediately apparent but accumulated over decades. By the late 20th century, bones closest to light sources showed visible degradation, yellowing, surface erosion, and increased fragility. The lighting that enhanced visitor experience was simultaneously destroying the material visitors came to see. The 10th link was the curatorial decision in the 1860s to commission František Rint, a woodcarver from Česká Skalice, to create new decorative elements using the skeletal material. Rint's work, completed in 1870, included a large coat of arms representing the Schwarzenberg family, who owned the property at that time, a chandelier incorporating every type of bone in the human skeleton, chalices, monstrances, and garlands. These creations required selecting, shaping, and assembling bones in ways that had no precedent in the earlier organizational phases. Rint's intervention fundamentally redefined the relationship between bone and decoration. In Santini Eichel's Baroque arrangement, bones were organized into architectural forms: pyramids, columns, arches that referenced sacred geometry, but preserved the bone's structural integrity. Rint, by contrast, treated bones as raw material for sculptural fabrication. Individual bones were cut, drilled, and fastened together using wire, dowels, and adhesives. The coat of arms alone required hundreds of bones shaped and assembled into heraldic imagery: crowns, ravens, crescents, and fields. This fabrication process was destructive. Drilling created stress concentrations that propagated as cracks. Cutting removed material, reducing structural strength. Adhesives introduced chemical contaminants that altered the bone's composition. Wire fastenings imposed localized loads that exceeded the material's bearing capacity, causing progressive deformation. The decorative elements Rint created were therefore inherently unstable. They looked impressive when completed, but were destined to fail structurally over time. The 11th link was the 20th century decision to dismantle some of Rint's hanging decorations due to safety concerns and changing aesthetic preferences. By the mid-1900s, several garlands and smaller ornaments had fallen or were visibly deteriorating. Rather than repair them using Rint's methods, administrators removed them entirely and stored the constituent bones separately. This created a material discontinuity. The ossuary now contained 3 categories of skeletal remains with different histories: original organized material from the 1500s to 1700s, Rint's fabricated elements from 1870, and disassembled bones from dismantled decorations. This material heterogeneity complicated conservation planning. Should the ossuary be restored to its post-Rint configuration, accepting the structural instability of his decorations? Should it be restored to the pre-Rint Baroque state, requiring disassembly of the coat of arms and chandelier? Should the disassembled bones be reincorporated into displays, and if so, how? Each option required destroying some aspect of the site's historical layering. No option preserved all phases simultaneously. The system had accumulated so many transformations that reversibility was impossible. The 12th link was the late 20th and early 21st century imposition of modern heritage conservation standards. Once the Church of the Assumption of Our Lady in St. John the Baptist was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1995, with the ossuary located in the buffer zone, the entire complex became subject to international preservation frameworks. These frameworks mandate minimal intervention, reversibility of treatments, and documentation of all changes. They also require environmental monitoring, visitor management, and long-term conservation planning. These standards, while well-intentioned, created operational contradictions. The ossuary's entire history was a sequence of interventions that were irreversible, undocumented, and environmentally uncontrolled. Applying modern standards retroactively was impossible. Applying them prospectively meant freezing the site in its current state, preventing the kind of adaptive modification that had characterized its entire evolution. The system that had thrived through continuous transformation was now required to remain static, which violated the institutional logic that had sustained it for 5 centuries. The 13th link was the decision to undertake comprehensive renovation between 2011 and 2020, including archaeological excavation of the cemetery and interior of the ossuary, structural repairs, installation of climate control systems, and partial reconstruction of one bone pyramid. These interventions revealed the site's physical complexity in unprecedented detail. Excavations beneath the bone pyramids discovered construction debris and fragmented bone intermixed as fill material, indicating the pyramids were not solid bone throughout, but hollow structures, with exterior surfaces of intact skeletal elements and interiors of aggregate waste. This discovery fundamentally challenged the veneration narrative. If the pyramids contained construction debris, broken bricks, mortar fragments, damaged architectural elements, then they were not purely devotional objects but expedient solutions to a combined spatial and disposal problem. The monastery had used the pyramids to simultaneously organize skeletal displays and contain building waste generated during reconstruction projects. The sacred and the utilitarian were literally intermixed, indistinguishable in the aggregate core. The 14th link was the curatorial dilemma posed by this discovery. Should the pyramid be reconstructed as it was, preserving the historical method including the debris core? Should it be reconstructed using only intact bones, eliminating the debris but creating an ahistorical configuration? Should the debris be documented and displayed separately to reveal the construction method? Each option privileges different values: historical authenticity, aesthetic coherence, or educational transparency. The choice was not technical but philosophical, and there was no consensus among stakeholders: monastery administrators, conservation specialists, heritage authorities, and the public about which value should dominate. The 15th link was the recognition that the ossuary's skeletal material derived from multiple temporal and contextual sources with different degrees of documentation. Some bones came from individual graves with associated markers or records. Others came from mass graves without individual identification. Some were exhumed according to standard procedure after natural decomposition. Others were recovered during construction activities or cemetery reconfigurations. This heterogeneity meant that the bones visible in displays could not be assumed to represent a homogeneous population of the dead of Sedlec. They represented a mixed assemblage whose composition reflected centuries of institutional priorities, spatial constraints, and historical contingencies. This realization destabilized the anthropological interpretations that had been applied to the ossuary. Researchers had attempted to extract demographic data: age at death, sex ratios, health indicators, from samples of the displayed bones. But if the displayed bones were a non-random selection, shaped by organizational and aesthetic criteria rather than representative sampling, then demographic conclusions were invalid. The bones visible in pyramids and decorations were those judged suitable for display: intact, aesthetically pleasing, structurally sound. Fragmented, pathological, or otherwise unsuitable bones were excluded, creating systematic bias in any analytical sample. The 16th link was the chemical contamination introduced by mining-related pollutants. Kutna-Hora's economy was built on silver mining, which produced substantial quantities of toxic byproducts including arsenic, cadmium, lead, and zinc. These elements were released through smelting operations and dispersed across the landscape through airborne particulates and water drainage. The Sedlec Cemetery, located downwind and downslope from major mining areas, received chronic exposure. Geochemical analysis of cemetery soils and skeletal samples revealed elevated concentrations of all these elements. More significantly, the elements were present not only in burial soils, which could represent post-depositional contamination, but within the bones themselves, indicating ante-mortem exposure through drinking water, food, or occupational contact. This contamination may have contributed to the legend of the holy soil's unusual properties. Arsenic and heavy metals inhibit microbial activity, potentially slowing decomposition under certain conditions while accelerating it under others, depending on concentration and environmental context. The contamination also posed conservation challenges. Bones containing high levels of arsenic or lead are chemically unstable and require specialized handling to prevent both material degradation and human health risks for conservators. Standard cleaning methods could mobilize toxic elements, creating occupational hazards. The site's history as a sacred space was now entangled with its history as a contaminated industrial landscape, and these dimensions could not be separated in conservation planning. The 17th and final link in the failure chain was the recognition that the ossuary had become a self-referential system whose primary function was no longer theological or commemorative but touristic. By the 21st century, The vast majority of visitors were not pilgrims seeking spiritual intercession but tourists seeking aesthetic experience and photographic documentation. The site had been featured in popular media, travel guides, and social networks as a must-see destination characterized by its macabre beauty and historical curiosity. This functional transformation completed the cycle that began 5 centuries earlier. The ossuary started as infrastructure supporting cemetery operations. It became a devotional space validating theological narratives. It evolved into an artistic installation demonstrating institutional prestige. It ultimately transformed into a tourist attraction whose meaning derived primarily from its own history of transformation. The bones no longer primarily represented the dead of Sedlec awaiting resurrection. They represented the accretion of historical decisions that had brought those bones to their current configuration. The failure, if it can be called that, was not mechanical or procedural. It was existential. The system had drifted so far from its original purpose that restoration to that purpose was conceptually incoherent. The question, what should the ossuary be, could not be answered by reference to design intent because the design had been iteratively overwritten across centuries. Each generation had reimagined the space according to contemporary needs, producing a palimpsest in which earlier purposes remained partially visible but no longer determinative. The physics of the failure was the physics of accumulated decisions under constraints that shifted faster than institutional memory could track. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, following extensive Baroque renovations, the Sedlec Ossuary entered a phase of attempted stabilization. Institutional authorities recognized that the ossuary, having accumulated centuries of spatial reorganization, architectural embellishment, and layered narratives, required active maintenance to prevent structural and symbolic decline. The initial interventions focused on reinforcing the physical arrangement of bones within pyramids, stabilizing hanging elements, and ensuring that visitor access did not compromise structural integrity. Supervisors implemented systematic procedures to dust, realign, and repair displaced skeletal components. These efforts were technically effective in preserving the immediate aesthetic and devotional appearance, but they did not address underlying systemic vulnerabilities, such as the fragility of centuries-old skeletal material or the heterogeneity introduced by multiple successive interventions. The first stabilization challenge arose from material aging. Skeletal components composed of organic collagen matrices and inorganic hydroxyapatite exhibited progressive brittleness and susceptibility to microfracturing. Maintenance routines required handling every displaced or loose bone, introducing mechanical stress that accelerated degradation. Conservators had to balance the need to correct observable displacements against the risk of inducing additional fractures. These actions illustrate the paradoxical nature of stabilization. Each corrective operation, while locally beneficial, contributed to long-term material weakening. Secondary crises emerged as the ossuary's role expanded beyond devotional function. The Baroque arrangements, including pyramids, suspended crowns, and reliquary-like glass housings, were vulnerable to environmental fluctuations. Temperature and humidity variations exacerbated by increased visitor access introduced cyclical moisture absorption and desorption in bone tissue. These fluctuations generated internal stresses, manifested in cracking, delamination, and surface erosion. Physical interventions such as support structures or protective glazing mitigated some stress but imposed new constraints. Any modification had to respect the visual composition, religious symbolism, and visitor experience. Stabilization thus became an optimization problem across 3 domains: structural, aesthetic, and institutional, where improvements in one domain often introduced compromises in another. A further secondary crisis originated in institutional economics. By the 18th century, the ossuary functioned as a regional pilgrimage attraction. Revenue derived from donations, commemorative services, and visitor contributions reinforced the imperative to maintain the ossuary in a visually impressive state. Financial dependency created pressure to prioritize visible restoration over underlying conservation. As a result, actions that enhanced spectacle, such as reinforcing pyramids, polishing bones, or adding temporary decorative elements, were favored over interventions that addressed material longevity or historical authenticity. The ossuary thus became a system where operational priorities reinforced cyclical stresses, generating a feedback loop between stabilization measures and secondary degradation. Human factors compounded these crises. Staff and monastic caretakers were trained primarily in ritual and organizational practices, not in material science. Their understanding of bone fragility, microclimatic effects, and cumulative mechanical stress was limited. Procedures emphasized maintaining visual order, religious propriety, and spatial efficiency, leaving physical vulnerabilities under-monitored. Control mechanisms were reactive. Interventions occurred after displacement or damage was observed, rather than being guided by predictive models of material behavior. Consequently, every stabilization action introduced latent stress, creating the conditions for future crises. Secondary crises were also embedded in structural heterogeneity. The ossuary contained multiple generations of interventions. Early 16th century organized stacks, 17th century Baroque enhancements, rinse 19th century fabricated sculptures, and later dismantled or stored elements. Stabilization attempts had to reconcile these disparate material forms. Integrating new bones into existing arrangements required careful alignment to preserve the intended composition. Displaced or degraded materials, if left unattended, would disrupt the integrity of the overall display. Yet, interventions risked physically damaging older, more fragile components. The system's complexity thus amplified both operational risk and uncertainty. Maintaining one section could destabilize another. Environmental management was introduced as a formal stabilization strategy in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Limited ventilation systems, controlled access, and physical barriers were installed to mitigate visitor-induced fluctuations in temperature, humidity, and mechanical stress. These interventions reduced the rate of material degradation but introduced operational constraints. Restricted access conflicted with the ossuary's economic function, and environmental controls required continuous monitoring and resource allocation. The solution alleviated secondary crises locally, but imposed systemic dependencies. The ossuary's stability now depended on ongoing institutional capacity to maintain these controls. In parallel, curatorial interventions addressed symbolic and narrative crises. The ossuary's layered stories, holy soil legends, miracle narratives, and Baroque aesthetic interpretations established expectations that specific configurations and features be preserved. Stabilization measures thus had to respect narrative fidelity. When bones were replaced, repositioned, or consolidated, staff had to ensure that new arrangements aligned with both visual and symbolic templates established centuries earlier. This constraint amplified operational complexity. Stabilization was not a matter of physical preservation alone, but of narrative and ritual conformity. The ossuary had evolved into a multidimensional system in which physical, economic, and symbolic stability were interdependent. By the early 21st century, these secondary crises converged with modern heritage mandates. Conservation frameworks imposed requirements for minimal intervention, reversibility, and documentation. Stabilization could no longer rely on centuries-old practices that had prioritized adaptation over system integrity. Measures that previously mitigated secondary crises now faced formal constraints. Environmental modifications had to comply with UNESCO standards. Structural reinforcements could not alter historic compositions, and material handling had to avoid chemical or mechanical contamination. Each constraint limited the range of feasible interventions, highlighting the tension between historical operational logic and contemporary conservation objectives.